Ms. Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, might I, before the witness is sworn in, the next witness, Ms. Louisa Fuzile, might I bring an application for condonation for the late filing of the notice, 3.3 notices? It's in respect of the 4 implicated persons, Mr. Bobat, Mr. Whitley, Mr. Des van Rooyen, and Mr. Mabaso. Might I also mention, Mr. Chairman, that they are represented. My learned friend, Mr. Masuku and Mr. Denga, they are present.
But I haven't read those.
I delivered the bundle.
No arrangement was made that the application would be brought or moved now, at this time that I know of.
As the chairperson, please.
Have I misunderstood anything?
Yeah,
we normally arrange to say when will the application be moved, then I give approval, then I'm expecting it to be moved at that time, so I know that I have to look at the papers before that time.
maybe that was then not communicated properly when the bundle was delivered to the chairperson yesterday.
I certainly have seen a bundle.
Yes.
But as you may have heard earlier on when Mr. Pretorius was moving the application for condonation in respect of implicated persons who are implicated in Mr. Gordhan's statement, as you heard, I had here another condonation application relating to Mr. Nene, which hasn't been moved yet, but yes, it's there.
Yes.
So he told me that, and you would have heard that it's separate, it will be dealt with
separately.
Separately.
Yes. If the chairman
so I certainly did receive some papers, but in terms of when that will be moved,
you were not notified.
I'm not aware that it was to come.
May it then stand down, Mr. Chairman, then we'll arrange a date for the hearing of that application.
Yeah, is it unopposed?
It is unopposed. All the parties, the implicated persons are represented, and they are not opposing the application.
Yeah. Okay, no, let's deal with it tomorrow. Let me read those papers, because I haven't read those papers.
As you please.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Malega.
Chair, good afternoon.
How are you?
Well, Chair, but not as well as I could after the captivating closing remarks of Minister Gordhan.
Yes.
And Chair, I hope that the next round of witness evidence we are going to present to you in the next 2 days would not be anticlimactic and forceless in the light of Minister Gordhan's captivating evidence, particularly his reference to the well-known work and poem of Professor Niemöller, the famous German theologian and activist of the time who opposed the Nazi regime and chose to speak when many felt it was appropriate to remain silent. It is a task that we thrive before you to encourage so many others of our people to do right by speaking and not repeat the mistake Professor Niemöller warned his compatriots at the time. Chair, we would prefer to present the evidence of 3 National Treasury witnesses with reference to the terms of reference, paragraph 1.8, which centers their evidence. You would recall that it is that part of the terms of reference that deals with the arrival of then Minister van Rooyen at National Treasury, together with certain individuals who sought to strong-arm officials of National Treasury by imposing or purporting to issue instructions to them when they had not yet been properly and lawfully appointed as directors in terms of the relevant provisions of Section 12A of the Public Service Act, read together with a special dispensation prescribed by a cabinet that Mr. Fuzile will deal with. So, although all of them will deal with that part of the terms of reference, some of their evidence, especially that of Mr. Fuzile, might well traverse to the terms of reference in paragraph 1.1 to 1.3 that you're currently dealing with in this phase 1 of the proceedings, especially insofar as that evidence deals with the various ministers of finance who came in and out at the door of National Treasury, about which he will testify. And Chair would prefer to present that evidence by identifying the data set that we will converse with the witnesses and that would ask you to have ready at hand, so that there is not some miscommunication or confusion about what that data set is. So if I may indicate to you what the data set is, Chair, and I'm aware that your registrar conveyed to us that you do not want clutter on your desk as we present that evidence.
I mean, some references you might make may require that I have a look at the relevant pages.
Yes.
Others we can do without me having had to have a look.
Yes.
But you would know which ones are really important for me to have a look at.
Indeed, Chair. As best as I can, I will indicate when it is important for you to turn to the relevant page of the data set. And I will do so, of course, by also inviting Mr. Fuzile to do so, because he will be speaking from first-hand knowledge in regard to the cross-section of the documents in the different files. So just to identify them, Chair, and also for Mr. Fuzile, the first will be Exhibit A, which we now know it is the Public Protector's Report. That is the basis of the term of reference, which is paragraph 1.8. You need not go there at the moment, Chair. I simply identify.
I'm just making sure that I have the right file in front of me. That should be in front of me right now. Earlier on, I had a bundle with Ms. Pumla Williams' evidence, which, though it might be referred to in due course, really is not of immediate importance. The one that I now have has Exhibit P.
Exhibit B.
No, P for Patrick.
Yes, we'll get to P in a moment, Chair.
But it's not the one that I should have immediately.
Not yet. But really the point of reference...
The one that I should have, I assume, would have Mr. Fuzile's statement and so on. Where is
that's Exhibit P.
Is that Exhibit P?
Yes, we'll get to it in a moment.
Okay. All right.
For now, it can be on your desk.
Okay.
And you don't have to get to it at the moment.
Okay.
I have identified Exhibit A. In fact, it should be Exhibit B, which is the Public Protector's Report, because you'll recall, Chair, that in her report she said time and resources did not permit her to engage in that complaint that was unanimously lodged before her, but found some level of prima facie course of investigation in the light of various media reports. And then the next data set, Chair, that we would ask you to have in mind is Exhibit F, which is Ms. Williams' statement and bundle of evidence that was usefully canvassed by our learned colleague, Ms. Hofmeyer, when she led Ms. Williams, The importance of that bundle, Chair, is that it comprises legislative instruments that govern how public officials and advisory individuals to ministers are appointed. And that bundle also contains regulations that deal with the specimen contracts that are executed by persons employed in the public service. One of the references in that bundle will be section 12A. Although Ms. Fuzile in his statement quotes that section, we would prefer to refer you to the official version of it to make sure that we're not criticized for following blindly possible typos in his quotation. Chair, the next bundle will be Exhibits N, and we would refer to Exhibit N1 and its accompanying bundles that Mr. Pretorius has identified as A to F. You would recall that that is a set of documents that Minister Gordhan canvassed. You would recall that at different stages of his evidence, Minister Gordhan indicated that Mr. Fuzile might well give you more evidence on aspects that he foreshadowed. I doubt that Mr. Fuzile would do so fully now, because he indicates quite clearly in his statement that for the present purposes, he is here to assist you on term of reference in paragraph 1.8. But of course, he is free to indicate whether or not he will be able to help you now or later on matters that Mr. Gordhan has identified. And then, Chair, there will be reference to N2, which is the supplementary bundle prepared for the purposes of Minister Gordhan. It is important, Chair, because in it, he references two most important items. The one is the statement of a whistleblower. I won't mention her name, but with reference to that evidence, you inquired from Mr. Pretorius whether or not the legal team and or the investigators of the commission have sought to obtain a statement of some sort from the whistleblower. Chair, we can confirm now that indeed the investigators have, in the light of the crucial information volunteered by the whistleblower. We present that statement to you together with its annexures as Exhibit R. To the extent possible, Chair, I will canvass elements of Exhibit R with Mr. Fuzile to establish, firstly, whether or not National Treasury, for as long as he was there, had become aware of the information volunteered by the whistleblower. If so, what did they do about that information? Did they conduct any investigation? And if so, what is the result of that investigation? Chair, Minister Gordhan also referenced other matters in relation to the possible abuse of the South African currency market by individuals who may have gained prior confidential information about the possible dismissal of Minister Nene. And there is some reference in the bundle that was presented as N2 of one individual who may have made money as a result of being armed confidentially with that information. In the financial markets, Chair, you would recall that that type of secret information will be identified and regarded as insider trading, open to prosecution. The evidence of Mr. Gordhan in that regard was that the Commission must begin about the process of recovering those illicit gains. I will refer to part and parcel of Exhibit N to test with Mr. Fuzile whether or not there is any semblance of truth insofar as is concerned about those allegations. Again, it's a matter that Minister Gordhan left for him to educate us to the extent that possible. Against the background of that data set, Chair, may I ask your registrar to administer the oath for Mr. Fuzile.
Thank you.
Please state your full names for the record.
I'm Longesa Fuzile.
Do you have any objection with making the prescribed oath?
No.
Do you consider the oath to be binding on your conscience?
Yes.
Do you swear that the evidence you'll give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair, now is the time to ask you to admit the bundle which has been marked as Exhibit R as an exhibit before you. Sorry, Exhibit P.
The bundle well, before we do that, shouldn't this bundle be starting with Mr. Fuzile's statement? Why do we need the condonation application to be there as well? Is it not just going to be increasing a lot of paper necessary, because the condonation application is something we deal with now and we put aside and we may never have to go back to it. But the witnesses' statements and annexures to those statements will need to be read from time to time. But
Chair, if I may,
I think condonation applications should really be separate, because after they have been dealt with, they'll hardly need to be looked at after that.
Yes. Chair, if I may provide some explanation on behalf of those who packaged this bundle and suggest a middle ground. The condonation application was put up front and indexed from page 1 because it relates to the witness statements which follow thereafter. And then you will see that at the end of the bundle, there is reference to the notices that have been served on several implicated parties. It has been packaged in this perhaps complex form to ensure that it will be the only bundle that relates to the witnesses from National Treasury, the implicated persons from their statements, as well as the applications for condonation. That is why it has been sequentially paginated from 1 to the end, and you will see that each of these statements is accompanied by an index of its own. So, for instance, if you start at page 1 of the bundle, you will see that there's an index of the application for condonation from page 1 to the end. And then the next you will see that is the statement of Ms. Pumza Makanda, which begins at page 20.
Probably what I said, I probably should have said, should the bundle not have started with that statement of Ms. Makanda, because I see it is there, and there is the
index.
There is the other statement of
Yes.
Mokachane as well.
That's at page 44.
Excuse me. So I guess that I expected. Excuse me. I expected Mr. Fuzile's statement, him being the first of the three to give evidence, to be
Indeed.
at the top. Yeah.
Indeed, and you'll find in the bundle as we have it, the statement of Mr. Fuzile from page 54.
Yes.
So that
yes.
those who packaged it worked in reverse.
Yeah.
And let me apologize for them,
Yeah.
but may I proceed on the basis of the bundle as prepared, Chair?
No, that's fine. You may proceed. So it's only about 19 pages or so that they took the condonation application.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. You may proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Fuzile, I hope that you followed some of the introductory remarks that I've made. I've made them not in terrorem, but simply to try and place context to a number of questions that I'm going to put to you. And let me place on record that although you may have consulted, of course, through your legal representatives, with some of my colleagues, I certainly have not consulted with you. Is that correct?
That is true.
So that the first time you're going to hear questions from me about your testimony will be today, correct?
Yes, that is true.
You have several bundles before you. Can I ask you to place the bundle before you, especially on your right, because it will be the bundle that I will refer to from time to time, the one which is marked Exhibit P. It contains your statement together with those of your ex-colleagues. Can I ask you to turn to page 55 of that bundle?
While Mr. Fuzile is doing that, Mr. Malega, we didn't complete what we needed to do, or I needed to do, because of the query about the inclusion of the condonation application here. Yes. So the bundle that contains, among others, the statement of Mr. Lungisa Fuzile and Ms. Pumza Makanda will be marked Exhibit P.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Mr. Fuzile, I had asked you to go to your statement which begins at page 55. Are you there?
Yes, sir.
That is the table of your statement which begins at page 56 and runs up to page 75. Can I ask you to immediately turn to page 75?
I am there.
You will see that there is almost in the end of the top half of that page your name, and above it there is some signature. Whose signature is that?
It is my signature.
And there is a date below. Can I ask you to identify that date?
The date is the 16th of November this year.
Do you confirm that that is the date on which you signed that statement?
Yes.
In reverse, can you go back to page 56?
I'm there.
Can I clear some few elementary issues about your statement beginning from page 56? You have had an occasion to read the statement before you took the witness box this afternoon, correct?
Yes.
Do you confirm that the contents of the statement which you have read before are correct, or is there any aspect of it that you would wish to correct before we get to the contents of it?
Chair, there is only one thing on the next page.
Is that page 57?
Page 57.
Yes.
Paragraph 11 should be deleted.
Paragraph 11.
11.
The whole of it.
The whole of it. It's a very short one-line paragraph.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. So 11 is one sentence, actually.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Subject to that deletion, do you confirm that the statement as read is correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, Chairman.
The next elementary thing that I would like to raise with you, although you deal with it in the first 3 paragraphs of your statement, is your background. I understand from your statement that you have been invited by the Commission to prepare this statement, and that you have a long story to tell about your involvement in National Treasury and allegations of state capture that are presently being investigated by the chairperson, correct?
That is correct.
But for now and for the purposes of your present statement and testimony, you have elected to confine yourself to paragraph 1.8 of the terms of reference at the request of the Commission's legal team, correct?
That is true. I've confined myself to TOR 1.8.
Before you proceed, Mr. Maleka, maybe I should just say, Mr. Fuzile, that thank you for coming forward. As you would definitely know, we have been asking more people, particularly the executive, past and present, and former DGs and current DGs who have information about what we are investigating to come forward. And such matters as you might wish to tell the Commission about, which you might not be able to tell the Commission about at this stage, we certainly are interested in those if they fall within the terms of reference of the Commission, and in due course we will be very happy to have your evidence in regard to all those other matters.
And Mr. Fuzile, you heard time without number the Commission making an appeal to a number of witnesses who have testified that they should make themselves available even though they may have completed the current phase of their testimony. And I know now that you are in the private sector employment, that it would not be too inconvenient for you when the Commission requested to come back to complete your story about your involvement in National Treasury and allegations of state capture to the extent that you'll be able to contribute. Is that fair?
Chair, it might be inconvenient, but if it has to be done, I would do it. I say this on the presumption that there would be reasonableness in terms of
Notice.
the time allowed to prepare a proper detailed statement on whatever matters that I would like to ventilate with the Commission, and of course, allowing me also reasonable time in terms of the date that's set, bearing in mind that the Commission does not have a century to do its work.
Indeed. And we keep on learning as we march along, and we will avoid previous inconveniences that may have cost to you, for which I frankly would apologize to you.
I accept the apology. And I may say on paragraph 3 of the statement, I do signal the willingness to avail myself should the Commission invite me to come and tell the story on other aspects beyond paragraph 1.8 of the terms of reference.
Thank you, Mr. Fuzile. The next elementary matter of background that you deal with, and by the way, let me interrupt myself. I'm not going to ask you to read each and every paragraph of your statement. I will identify various paragraphs simply as a signal to tell you where I am. But if you choose to read, either as a matter of emphasis or as a matter of public record, any aspect or paragraph of your statement, please do so. Feel free to do so. The next elementary matter of background that you deal with begin from paragraph 4 of your statement at page 56. And you start by indicating your employment in Treasury. But before we get there, can I ask you your formal qualifications? I mean, what formal qualifications, if any, do you have?
I studied commerce, majored in economics and industrial psychology, proceeded to study a qualification in education as a teacher before I went on to study economics at a postgraduate level, graduating with a Master of Commerce degree in economics at the University of Natal. I think it was 1997. And of course, beyond that, I have done courses in management, in finance, some with certificates, others without certificates. I also consider myself to be qualified in farming, actually.
In farming?
Yes.
Are you a farmer at the moment?
I am learning, and I'm getting better every day.
Chair, you and I have a hard road to follow.
Well, just for the sake of completeness, Mr. Fuzile, what you have said suggests maybe that your first degree was BCom.
Yes, Chairman.
Yes. And after the BCom, you did MCom?
A higher diploma in education, to be precise, Chairman.
Yes.
And then I did honors in economics and then masters in economics.
Okay, thank you. And do you intend getting any formal qualification in farming?
I've paid my tuition fees in the practical work that I've been doing since I was a little boy, okay, at my father's feet.
Okay. Hopefully that will make you relax and you can give your evidence properly. Thank you, Mr. Malega.
Thank you, Chair. And then you indicate in paragraph 9 of your statement at page 57 that you left National Treasury in 2017. Do you recall which month of 2017 did you leave National Treasury?
Yes, Chairman, my last day was the 17th of May, if I remember correctly, a Monday in March this year, last year, pardon me.
Yes. And you say before you left in May 2017, you had been in National Treasury for a full 19 years.
That's correct.
On my elementary mathematical calculation, it means that you ought to have joined National Treasury about 1998.
That is correct, Chairman.
You have been there for almost a generation. And some people would define you as part and parcel of the furniture of National Treasury before you left.
I would hope good quality furniture, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Fuzile, it's up to you. And I know that you have deleted paragraph 11 of your statement. Are you able and do you feel comfortable in disclosing reasons to the chairperson why you left National Treasury, having been there as part and parcel of the good furniture?
Certainly.
Could you please tell us why you left?
Perhaps the place to start, Mr. Chairman, would be just the period before May 2011. I had been a Deputy Director General in a division of the Treasury called Assets and Liability Management. That is a division whose responsibility, in summary, is or entails raising money, in other words, borrowing, which had been described very eloquently here by my former boss, Minister Gordhan, which entails short-term borrowing for just cash management purposes to bridge cash flow shortfalls that might occur between the inflows in revenues that people and businesses pay, and of course the outflows insofar as the expenditure of government relating to, for an example, salaries, transfers to provinces and local government in terms of their grants and so on and so forth. We borrow for that purpose, or we would borrow for that purpose in that division, but also, of course, borrow just to finance the long-term the annual shortfall between revenue and expenditure, which is to finance the deficit, so to speak, in technical terms. That's the one leg of what that division was responsible for. The other leg was the asset management, which is oversight over state-owned entities, but at the same time taking care of government's assets, such as the cash that would be in the bank at any given time. Being in that role, my predecessor getting promoted in Mr. Leseja Khanyaho, who is the governor now, but he was promoted to become the deputy governor. So someone had to take over the role of DG. I start here because I was very reluctant, actually, to take the job. It's important for context to say this. So because I knew what the job entailed, that it's a very heavy job, difficult job, entails a lot of traveling, but at the same time, because it's a job that entails telling people stuff that they don't quite like to hear, which is that there is no money to do sometimes good things that they would like to do. Of course, other times, not so good things that people would want to do. So I was reluctant, and I actually didn't apply for the job. And the due date for the submission of the applications came and passed, and I suppose when the people were looking through the applications, they were hoping to find mine there as well, so that I would contest or compete for the job like others, but I hadn't applied. So there was an extension of or reopening of this, and some persuasion that was done by several people. I needn't mention their names here. And ultimately I yielded, took the job. 5 years on, my contract was close to expiration. In fact, it was not even 5 years on. 2015 December happened, which is the removal of Mr. Nene, and my contract was supposed to expire in May of the following year. And one of the things that happened, I want to cut the long story short, was that when Minister Gordhan was returned to Treasury, one of the first things he said, I suspect he didn't even greet me, was that my return has got implications for your career plans. And I said to him,
I'm sorry, just repeat that.
He said, my returning to Treasury as finance minister, as Minister Gordhan, has got implications for your career plans. And I knew what that meant. Of course, we didn't talk about it at the time. We joked, and I said, look, we'll talk about it. Again, to cut a long story short, he then persuaded me to extend my contract. And I said, look, I can only do 2 years at most, but I can guarantee giving you 1 year of my time. And I said, of course, given the high turnover of ministers of finance, I suspect that you will most likely be my last minister. So when we then returned from that road show to London, end of March in 2017, the writing was on the wall for me that Minister Gordhan's time as Minister of Finance was up, and I decided, of course, as I had indicated to him and the team at Treasury, my colleagues, who had also been part of persuading me to stay a little longer, that my time at Treasury was up.
Yes. Mr. Fuzile, I can assure you that we will deal with the ministerial revolving door of Treasury, through which a number of ministers came in and out, in detail, because you expressed some strong views around it. But let me just clear the record in relation to the evidence you have given relating to your appointment as the Director General of National Treasury. You have now confirmed that you were recruited to apply. Can I ask you, when precisely were you appointed as the Director General of National Treasury?
My career as DG commenced, I think, on the 16th of May 2011. I might be off by a day or just hours.
Yeah. Let's work with the period of May 2011. Who was the Minister of Finance at the time?
The Minister of Finance at the time was Minister Gordhan.
And his deputy?
His deputy at the time was Mr. Nene.
Right. And then Minister Gordhan has explained to us the complex structure of National Treasury and the number of state institutions which are subject to the oversight of National Treasury. I don't want to waste time by inviting you to comment or corroborate his evidence in that regard. For now, you can accept that his evidence remains uncontested. What I'd like to clear with you, though, is the summary of the overall responsibilities of the Director General for National Treasury. Insofar as management of National Treasury is concerned, are you able to take a moment and summarize them as neatly as you can for us?
I certainly can.
Yes.
Given the vastness of the job, I must confess, Chairman, up front that it is not going to be a clinical job. Essentially, the Director General of the National Treasury is defined in law as the accounting officer of the department. It is very important to draw a distinction between the accounting officer role as it pertains to Treasury versus what happens in most departments. Because in most departments, people use the term accounting officer and head of department interchangeably. It doesn't apply, though, at Treasury. In relation to Treasury, the head of Treasury is the Minister of Finance by law. And you would find this in the Public Finance Management Act. So the Director General of the National Treasury, like all other other DGs, is the accounting officer of the department. That's the first point to make. The second point to make is that the Director General of the Treasury is the chief, I would say, advisor to the Minister and the Deputy Minister of Finance on a whole range of issues, including processes of developing policy. It's very important at this point that I make this clear. The Director General doesn't make policy, but he is a key advisor to the Minister insofar as the process of making policy is concerned. That is so because even though it is the Minister who makes policy, the Minister does not have to be the one who does the technical work, the technical analysis that goes with, for instance, assessing the macroeconomic impact of introducing a change in VAT, if we were to take that as an example. That job gets reserved to technical persons like us who would say, these are the likely reactions, this is the likely amount of money that you might collect, and then the Minister would set the policy with that background. The running of the department is the job of the accounting officer. By the running of the department, I mean the development of internal departmental policies that would govern, for instance, things such as call it procurement within the department, because there is some allowance for certain departmental policies to be developed, but they have to be undergirded by the national policy frameworks relating thereto. The DG is responsible for that, developing all internal policies of a department that enable the proper functioning of the department. The management of the department in terms of setting the strategy, of course in consultation with the Minister and the Deputy Minister. The execution of that strategy and monitoring of the progress that is being made with the execution of that strategy, down to the point of performance management, insofar as ensuring that my direct reports as the DG are up to speed and apace with the targets that we have promised to Parliament and the nation, for that matter, through the state plan, making sure that that is in place. So the issues of, for instance, directing the department, issuing instructions in the department, disciplining people, dealing with appeals to the extent that elements of that disciplining may be delegated to lower levels, but the DG would still be one level of appealing in the department, and then of course ultimately it would be the Minister. Financial management in the department, making sure that at all times the department has got the resources that it needs to operate, pay salaries, pay rent, and all things relating to the operations of the department. And of course, making sure that whenever there is a commitment that the department makes, there are resources to pay for that commitment. And of course, of relevance to today's conversation. I don't know if I would be jumping the gun to...
Yeah, you will be jumping the gun. We'll get there.
Let me then pause before I do.
And you do deal with it specifically in parts of your statement that I'll canvass in some reasonable detail. But for now, I have a picture of what the main responsibility of the Director General of National Treasury uniquely is. Now, can I ask you to go to paragraph 12 of your statement? And I do so in the context of the fact that, like any Director General of a national department, you will be supported by deputy directors who will be part and parcel of your executive management. Now, in paragraph 12, you mention some names, and I'd like to converse some of them with you for this simple reason. Towards the concluding part of your statement, you talk about a conversation you had with then Deputy Minister Jonas relating to the conversation about who was targeted for exclusion from National Treasury, around which you make some observation relating to state capture. It is in that context that I'd like to converse some of the names that you reference in paragraph 12. Are you at paragraph 12?
Yes, I am.
Let's start with the name of Mr. Dondo Andrew Mukhajane. I can assure you that we will call him tomorrow, and he has agreed to testify. When you were the Director General, at the point when the controversy around Minister Nene took place, what was his position at the time?
At that time, Chairman, Mr. Mukhajane was the DDG for Public Finance.
And you mentioned the name of Mr. Michael Sachs. Who is he, and what was he at the time in National Treasury?
Mr. Michael Sachs was the head of a division that deals with the budget, and it's called the Budget Office. And I remember walking past the television at work, and I saw Minister Gordhan explaining the role of this office, as you were saying, Mr. Malega. He did it quite well. And I might just add at this point, by the way, that I think it would be correct to say that one of the important jobs of the Treasury is to prepare a budget for the country.
You know, we talk about this budget as some sophisticated animal. And I'd like you to decode it for us in elementary terms that I and the chairperson as lawyers, and maybe ordinary South Africans can understand. What is a budget?
Before Mr. Fuzile responds, can I confirm at the back that everybody can hear Mr. Malega? Yes, okay, thank you.
Chair, I will speak up.
Sometimes I'm struggling to hear you, but I'm very close.
I will.
Okay.
I will speak louder.
Yeah.
And I hope that next time they put a speaker next to you.
Thank you.
You
may proceed.
Recommendation of improvement around the setting that we will make to you, ahead of the many other important recommendations we will make on the work of the Commission. But I had invited you to explain to us in lay terms so that we too can understand the importance and significance of this complex animal called the budget.
At the very highest level, what a budget is an expression in numbers of the aspirations and wishes of a nation as processed by the political leadership that has been elected. What do I mean by this? When parties run to be elected, they make promises. We will do this in education, we'll do this with health, we'll do this for security, and so on and so forth. Until that gets expressed through the allocation of resources that the nation is able to mobilize, and I'll come back to what is involved in that mobilization. The promises are just up in the air. They are statements of intent. It is only when there is then an appropriation, and of course the other laws that would go with it, the division of revenue, for an example, between the three spheres of government, that, and that appropriation that I'm referring to would then say, to give effect to the promise of security, we will allocate these resources so that more policemen and women can be hired, so that cars can be bought, petrol can be filled in them, guns can be bought, and of course the rest of the stuff that goes with law enforcement can be done. That's what the budget does, yeah, in the simplest terms. Of course, if you start at the highest level, it's clear then that there must be policy priorities that a government sets for itself. And it is those policy priorities that must then guide the resource allocation process, that must be used to weigh one priority against the other. Because if everything is a priority, then there is no priority in very simple terms. Of course, as it happens within a household, every household would wish to have the best of everything, but most households can only afford so much. So again, even the national budget, once you have come to from the highest level of policy intent and priorities that a governing party wishes to deliver on, then it must assess how much resources it will be able to mobilize. And there are, in the main, two sources of revenue for government. In fact, it's only one. But we confuse each other by saying two. It's taxes, yes, and of course other revenues. Yes. When you finance spending today through debt, it is taxes of tomorrow, because you have to pay back the tax. So budgeting then is about balancing, finding the right balance between the wishes and aspirations and what you can actually afford. Yes. Of course, the ability to raise revenue in taxes is a function of the size of your economy, your GDP, and every component of it. So the budgeting exercise is about that. If there is a specific thing that you would wish me to home in on, yes, I can do so quickly.
Yes, I mean, I understand now that a budget is an executive authority's promise to the nation about the expected expenditure given policy priorities as against the expected income. Mm-hmm. And of course it is debated publicly. There's no secrecy about it. Mm-hmm. And we follow now and then the debates in Parliament, but ultimately it's adopted. But the point of that exercise is this, and I wanted to reflect on it and help us understand why that is the case. The product of a budget exercise and adoption involves National Treasury, and ultimately it is debated with the Office of the President. Correct?
Yes.
And therefore there cannot be any debate or confusion in any budget cycle about what the nation can afford given the budget. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I assume from your answer that every...
Perhaps, pardon me, Chair, there ought not to be any debate about what the nation can afford.
Yes.
But
Thank you.
Sometimes there is, you mean.
Precisely.
Yes, can I explore that with you a bit? And I accept your qualification that there ought not to be. But where the national executive is part and parcel of the debate, and it has participated in that national debate, in at least the National Assembly. Why should there be a debate on its part about what the nation can or cannot afford?
A number of things account for that. I mean, perhaps just make this broad point first. The South African budgeting process is one of the most advanced in the world. I say it with humility because I could sound like I'm gloating here because I was part of it, but it has been assessed independently by people who have not paid money to come to that conclusion. And several times they have made that conclusion after testing it a few times, comparing how we run the process to other nations. And I'm not talking, by the way, other emerging market economies or developing nations, including many advanced nations. So we run one of the most transparent, well-developed processes with very serious and deep political involvement in that process. Very rigorous technical analysis that goes with it. I will not bore this commission with that, but I could if I'm asked to. So, however, the nature of budgeting, especially at a time like the reference period that we're talking about, when the economy is not growing fast enough. In fact, if anything, when the rate at which GDP expands is decelerating year after year, when there is disappointment year after year in terms of revenue collection, in other words, revenue falls short of target every year, then budgeting becomes a very difficult exercise in terms of trade-offs. It means to do more of one thing. For an example, give a zero increase, which is something we had to grapple with at one point in time, in fees for higher education. It means that you must give up something. And it is usually in the giving up of something that the difficulty arises. Most people, I used to joke about it to my bosses, I've had many over the recent past in that role, that most of them prefer that the budget must only have pluses. So they would prefer to say, we have given higher education for free. We have given grant increases that are higher than inflation. We have given this. Once you say to them, let's then talk about how we're going to pay for it, they wish that they could just disappear because it's an inconvenient part, whichever way you think about it. Because you either have to explain why you are borrowing a lot, and if you are borrowing for consumption, it is hard to justify. Or you have got to tax more. And again, taxation is not a thing that is very popular with people who ply the trade of politics. So that is what then raises the contention, because it is about coming out, Chairman, and saying, I wish I could give you this thing, but our country cannot afford it.
Yes. Chair, I've got two more questions on the question of the budget, and with your leave, I suggest that they're important because to provide a context to this revolving door that we will converse with Mr. Fuzile. Minister Gordhan presented some of the numbers in relation to our historic budgets over the years. And one of the indicators he presented was that at some point in our budget cycles, South Africa enjoyed a budget surplus. And I think he mentioned that it was during the course of then President Mbeki. Are you able to help us with regards to additional information in that regard? Do you recall when was it that South Africa enjoyed the last budget surplus?
It was the years around 2007-8. The first of those was not really planned. In fact, we did characterize it as such. What had happened was that in the years of President Mbeki, the economy used to grow faster each year than the projection at the time of tabling the budget. So when we table a budget in February, we would project for a year and two ahead what the GDP growth rate is likely to be, because that's the base that you tax. And what often happened was that the economy would then, the actual growth would be higher than what we projected. That was the first reason why we had a surplus. But the second reason, we were embarrassed by SARS because it was getting too efficient and bringing all those who were supposed to pay taxes into the net and making most people pay their fair share of the taxes. So we would project that the taxes would be X, and the actual tax take at the end of the year would be X plus 1, yes, some bigger number. So as a consequence of those, it didn't matter that, in fact, expenditure was growing in double digits in real terms. By that I mean it would grow in excess of 10% in real terms. But the growth in revenue, driven by these two factors that I've talked about, was of such a nature that every year then there would be more money available than the money that was planned to be spent. Of course, we would bank it, and it happened year after year, and until in 2007-8, we realized, or around that time, first an unplanned surplus. But of course, there was a deep realization that the good years were not going to obtain forever. I was not DG at the time. The CIGA was, Mr. Manuel was the minister, and Minister Gordhan was the commissioner at SARS. But essentially, the coming together of all of these things, then it was obvious that it was not going to be there forever, because part of the growth in GDP was aided by a commodity boom. Prices of gold and other minerals rising and staying high for a protracted period of time, which then meant that the revenues that came from mining, but not only mining was the driver of growth during that time. So that then meant that our country was in a very, very good position. Yes. So then there was a plan to make sure that when the cycle turns, we must have planned surpluses for a series of years. Keep that money so that when bad years come, we would be able to set the budget in a counter-cyclical way, meaning that when the economy would be slowing down, we would draw on those savings and spend them so that we don't have to cut spending on social programs, investment, and so on and so forth.
Yes. Well, just to decode some of the complex macroeconomic terminology you used, you explain two indicators as the drivers of the budget surplus around 2007. The first was the economic growth, given what you call the GDP, gross domestic product. In my limited understanding, that's one of the indicators of economic growth. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And as against the economic indicator of the growth that South Africa enjoyed, of course, many other countries in 2007, you were able to make conservative budget estimates, I take it, in terms of ensuring that you are not going to go into an overestimation of expenditure. Is that correct?
That is correct, save for just one word which was used, we used to call it a swear word, conservative. Yes. They were prudent.
Prudent.
We tended to prefer that word, okay, because the one carries a little bit of, in fact not a little bit, carries conservative, conservative carries negative connotations.
Okay, let's work with the term prudent. So you're prudent enough. And as we know, the good economic times were not there to last forever. And we know that various analysts mark the year 2008 as the beginning of the global economic meltdown. And there were no longer tailwinds of economic growth, but many economies had to face the headwinds and ours was not an exception. Can I ask you to take that mark of 2008 and explain to us quite quickly what happened to our budget insofar as surplus or deficit is concerned? Your microphone, please.
It's off now. We started the year, in fact, we completed 2009, I think it was 2008, with the global financial crisis beginning. Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, all those kinds of banks folding. What that then did was to just send negative signals, or you can call it sentiment, across the globe, which eroded confidence in the financial systems or sectors of many countries, which then meant that most economies essentially had to not only downgrade their focus for growth, but many countries, including our own, in 2009 got into recession. The first budget that Minister Gordhan inherited from his predecessor, Mr. Manuel, was projecting, now on the back of that, against the backdrop of that global development, a deficit. Now I'm using memory here. If it can get me into trouble, but maybe I shouldn't talk numbers. But if you allow me to just talk ballpark figures, it would be fine. Yes,
I'd like to get to 2015. 2015,
okay. So we started there. We were looking at a growth at a deficit of around 3% in 2009. That was in February. By July, when Minister Gordhan had to table the budget vote for the Treasury, we had to announce that revenues were going to fall short by no less than 60 billion that year. That was just 4 months or so on, which meant that the deficit had to be revised up to about 6% projected at the time. Of course, if you just talk debt numbers, by 2008-9, our debt was sitting at around 426 or so billion, or about 24% of GDP, which is a kind of a measure that economists use to just get a relative sense of how big and affordable is your debt. Fast forward to 2015, we had to borrow over time, and of course sensibly so, if I may say. Yes. It was an appropriate approach to fiscal policy. In other words, to act counter-cyclically, avoid a bloodbath in terms of jobs, although one occurred, it could have been worse if this was not done. So there was investment in other things, and the spending that went with that saw us accumulating debt at quite a fast pace, so that by 2015, our debt was just slightly under 2 trillion if it hadn't reached that. Of course, there were several things that were done to make sure that we stay on track. For an example, we introduced under Minister Gordhan something we call an expenditure ceiling, which he talked about it. I won't bore you about it, but it was just a measure of discipline in fiscal management.
Can I show you that Minister Gordhan did talk about the expenditure ceiling and gave us some percentages.
Exactly. So most of it was responsible stuff. Let me just characterize this way. A lot of the time, I would explain, and I would do this even to rating agencies and investors, say, look, we have the propensity as a country to take the right decisions. But more often than not, it seemed to me towards the end of my tenure that people would take the right decision but get angry with it afterwards because it restrains them. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yes. You do, as far as I understand your evidence, and I'd like to conclude on the budget because that takes us to paragraph 14 of your statement, where you reference the last cabinet meeting you and Minister Nene attended on the, I think it was the 9th of December 2015. But just to conclude on the budget, as at 2015, we were running at a budget deficit of some sort, correct? I'd like you to indicate to the chairperson, precisely for that budget cyclical year, what was the indicated revenue side of the budget as against the expenditure side of the budget, so as to bring some figure to the extent of the deficit at the time. And finally, tell the chairperson how you fund that deficit and what will be the cost of funding with reference to any macroeconomic financial ratio that you can put up.
I know that I've been ringing these numbers as though I'm reading them from somewhere. I remember the ballpark figures, but
yes,
not exact numbers. I mean, our budget by that time was running into $1 trillion plus, 1.3, 1.4 trillion.
In my recollection, it was 1.4 trillion.
You see, 1.3, 1.4 trillion, so I'm close. And of course, the revenues were marginally less than that, about 1.2 something. So we would end up with a deficit of about 160, 170 billion or so. That translates to somewhere around 3.5 to about 4% deficit as a percentage of GDP. Yes. We would then fund that deficit of about 160, 170 billion through short-term debt, your treasury bills. They used to run at about 20 billion or so. And of course, long-term debt, which is your bonds, which is, they are of two kinds, inflation-linked bonds, and of course, what we call fixed interest or fixed income bonds, the ones on which a fixed coupon is paid in a year at 2 points normally. And of course, the importance of this point about running a deficit for purposes of macroeconomic policy, both from the point of view of what the central bank does with inflation, what Treasury does, the Minister of Finance, in terms of fiscal policy, is in relation to the fact that if a government and, of course, the central bank act in ways that can suggest that inflation can run away or debt can rise exponentially, is that people get scared of a country like that, because an investment you make today is worth nothing a year later because its value gets eroded by inflation, and it also, of course, if you are a foreign investor, gets eroded by the impact of the bad policies on your currency. Because if the rand gets weak, every day the rand depreciates, the value of an investment that a person who comes from abroad has put here falls. And we can go through their simple arithmetic if it is necessary, but I don't know.
It's not necessary, but the point is this, Mr. Fuzile, where I'd like you to help us is, if you don't have income of your own to budget, to fund your budget expenditure, you'll have to go out to the market and raise debt for which you will pay interest, correct?
That is correct.
And the extent of the interest you will pay varies according to the ratings that you as a country would enjoy. Is that correct?
Most definitely.
Yes. Chair, where I come from, people who borrow you money, they are called mashonisa. And they determine the extent of interest you will have to pay, given the risk you pose.
And they demand other items from you as well.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay.
So in that context, I begin to go to matters of fact now.
Yeah.
And they begin from paragraph 14 of your statement at page 57. You talk about a cabinet meeting following the removal of Minister Nene, or relating to the removal of Minister Nene. Can I stop you there and ask you this about then Minister Nene? That from what I read of your statement, when you refer to him, it suggests that you must have had some close, fond relationship with him. Is that a fair perspective?
It's correct.
Of the relationship you had?
That is correct.
Because at some point you talk about how you were moved, touched, and disaffected when he went to his office in his final days to collect his belongings.
Yes, he is a very personable character. I've been lucky because perhaps the most elegant way to say this, I've had a good relationship with most of the ministers I've worked with or for.
Yes. Now, from paragraph 15 of your statement, you talk about how you gained knowledge of his dismissal from cabinet. I take it that you are at paragraph 15?
Yes, I am.
Because I'd like to ask you about certain things. You recall at that point in time, you had been to cabinet with him, and you had made some presentation around budget topical matters at that point in time, including the so-called nuclear deal. Remember that? And then in paragraph 16 you say that...
Sorry. You might wish to articulate your answer yes or no so that it will be recorded.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, when you nod, it doesn't get recorded.
Yeah.
I'm not going to ask you to repeat that detail because it's now before the chairperson. Minister Nene testified about it.
Yes.
Minister Gordhan testified about it.
Yes, it's correct.
And there have been some tangential reference by Minister or Deputy Minister Jonas then, yeah. Unless you want to canvass that detail, but I, for my purposes, would not want to canvass that detail.
No, not now.
What I want to reflect on, though, is what you say in paragraph 15. You say around 1830, on that day, he sent you a message, a telephonic data message, SMS. And he said in that message, I quote, "The axe has fallen," close quote. Do you confirm that that was the text nature of the message?
That is true, Chairman. That is the text message that I received from Mr. Nene around that time, that evening.
Yes. We will talk about what you did thereafter, but let me ask you this. What did you understand him to mean when he said, "The axe has fallen"?
I understood it to mean only one thing, Chairman, that he had been fired.
That phrase suggests that there must have been some contemplation or anxiety on his part about the prospects that he could be fired at some point. What was your knowledge of the speculation around his office at the time?
A day earlier, Minister Nene and I, and the same colleagues I mentioned, Mr. Dondo Mkhajan and Mr. Michael Sachs, had gone to a meeting that discussed nuclear. But as I said, it's not something that I want to canvass today. And the meeting was not pleasant. Things that happened around it, even before the meeting, had suggested a treatment of the Treasury, the Minister of Finance, as not being fully part of the rest of government. That's the one marker that I just could tell that the conversation hadn't gone well. Prior to that, in a very informal and I would even say rather awkward way, a while back, Minister Nene had walked into my office without saying much and said, these are tough times, but if I leave this place, I would rather leave it with my integrity intact. So, and I didn't ask him. When people normally talk along those terms with me, although I'm generally talkative and stuff like that, I leave them to say as much as they feel comfortable to say, but he didn't elaborate. So when he said this, I wasn't surprised. Needless to add as the last point that if not on that day, it may have been the day before, one of the daily newspapers carried an article that was predicting a cabinet reshuffle, and I think that it got most of the facts on what happened in relation to Mr. Nene and the Treasury spot on. About him going to be removed, going to be replaced. I'm not sure if it mentioned Mr. Van Rooyen by name, but it did make reference to a backbencher. It may have been him. I'm not sure if they were correct about backbencher because he was a chief whip of the party. But anyway, it did make a reference about him being replaced by someone of less
caliber.
Any word that's less offensive along those lines. But at the same time, it also said quite instructively that he would be sent to one of the international finance institutions. It may not have said the BRICS Bank. It may have said such as the IMF or such as the BRICS Bank, but it was not definitive on that. Yes. So when he said this, there was no surprise to me at all.
Right.
Before you proceed, Mr. Malega, we normally don't take any break after lunch, but I would like to take about a 10 minutes break and then we'll resume. We'll adjourn for 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, well, there you have it. A very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us here on SA Today. That's the state capture inquiry, of course, breaking a little bit there while we were still listening to the former Director General of the Department of Treasury, Lungisa Fuzile, who was basically explaining some technicalities when it comes to issues around budgets and the operations, of course, of the department. He came, of course, after the Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, who wrapped up his testimony today. So in a short while, of course, we'll get in touch with our reporter, Mzwandile Mbeje, who's been monitoring the inquiry, of course, and then he'll let us know as to what came out of that inquiry. All right, we're taking a quick break here on SA Today. We'll just take a look at the headlines when we come back.
Outsurance loves saving South Africans money on their car insurance. And once you're part of the family, we make it our mission to impress you with the best service possible.